My husband's family said I'd taint their bloodline. Now they want to see my kids. I was sitting in the kitchen when the phone rang. Outside the window, Atlanta was buzzing with its usual rhythm: cars, heat, the smell of magnolias wafting through the open door. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code was Southern, familiar to the point of nausea. I picked up the phone and the voice on the other end hit me like an old wound that had reopened. Marion, my mother-in-law, whom I hadn't heard in 5 years, spoke as if we had just had tea together yesterday. Her thin, shrill voice with a slight Georgia accent mumbled something about the weather, and then the main thing. She wanted to see my children. My children. I barely stopped myself from throwing the phone against the wall. This woman who once said that I would pollute their blood is now asking to see my kids as if she has some kind of right to do so. My name is Emily. I'm 35 and a black woman who grew up in Birmingham, where racism was not hidden behind polite smiles. But I was not prepared for what I saw in the family of David, my husband. His people, white, wealthy, the kind of people who boast of ancestry dating back to the Civil War, looked at me like dirt under their feet. Our wedding 8 years ago was the first blow. I stood in a white dress holding a bouquet of roses, and Marion whispered to her sister that I was not worthy of their name. She didn't know I was listening. Her husband, old Thomas with gray hair and cold eyes, held a look on his face as if I were a mistake that needed to be corrected. David stood by, smiling, but never once told them to stop. I thought, well, maybe they'll get used to it over time. I was wrong. That phone call from Marion brought it all back. Her voice trembled as she mentioned my twins, Sophia and Ethan. They are 6 and they are my sunshine, my meaning. She called them our little angels, and I felt my stomach clench in disgust. Ours? This woman has no right to even say their names. I remember the way she looked at me when I was pregnant, her eyes screaming that I was spoiling their heritage. Dark blood, she said one night at dinner, thinking I couldn't hear. Thomas nodded and David just ate his steak like it was normal. And now they want to see them? I sat in silence, listening to her prattle on about how time heals wounds, and how children need to know their family. My fingers gripped the tabletop so hard that my nails dug into my palms. Why no? 5 years of silence. 5 years of building my life from scratch after David disappeared from my life. I didn't just survive, I flourished. My interior design business has burst onto the Atlanta market, and now my name is known in circles his family could only dream of. And I've heard rumors. Their old mansion in Savannah, where they boasted of ancestral portraits, went under the hammer. Thomas lost everything in a foolish investment, and Marion, they say, sold her diamonds to pay the bills. Their pride, their pure blood, did not save them from falling. And now she calls, her voice trembling with false tenderness, begging for access to my children. I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and sharp as a knife. I told her I would think about it. My voice was steady, but inside I was boiling. She breathed a sigh of relief as if I had already agreed, and added something about how we've all made mistakes. Mistakes? Calling me a black mark on their heritage is not a mistake, it's a choice. I hung up and stared at the phone as if it might explode. Sophie ran into the kitchen, her curls swaying as she dragged me to play with dolls. Ethan chased after her with a toy sword, laughing. I looked at them, their golden brown eyes, their skin glowing with the warmth Marion had been so afraid of, and felt tears burning in my throat. These children were mine, not theirs. But for some reason that phone call kept coming back to me. I got up and started flipping through old photos on my phone. There was David and I at the wedding. I was beaming and he looked tense. Here I was with my belly when the twins were still inside, and Marion stood aside with a sour face. And here is the first photo of the twins, tiny, wrinkled, perfect. David had already retreated, his family was dragging him back, and I was left alone. That call from Marion was not just a request. It was a signal. Something has changed in their world, and they are coming back like hyenas that have sensed weakness. But I am not weak. I survived then, and I will survive now. The only question is, why do they think they can claim my children after everything they've done? And what the hell happened in those 5 years to make them come crawling back? Later that night, I sat with a glass of wine, looking at the children's drawings on the fridge. Sophie had drawn the 3 of us, me, her, and Ethan, under a rainbow. No David, no Grandma Marion. My children don't know her face, her voice, her poison. But that call never left my mind. Her words were like a stone in my stomach. She said she would come to Atlanta next week. Just to talk, she added. I felt my pulse quicken. This is not just a conversation. This was something more. And I knew that whatever it was, I wasn't going to let them crush me again. Not this time. I couldn't sleep after that call. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and the memories of my first years with David kept coming back to me like uninvited guests. That call from Marion had stirred up everything, the dirt, the pain, the humiliation that I had buried deep, thinking it would never come out. But here they were, fresh as yesterday. I remembered our honeymoon, a week that was supposed to be the beginning of a happy life, but became the first hint that I had married not just David, but his entire toxic family. We traveled to Miami, far from their estate in Savannah, but even there I could feel their eyes, their words, seeping through David's phone calls and hints. I remember that evening on the beach. The sun was setting, the ocean was making noise, and I was sitting in a light dress holding a cocktail. David was next to me, but his eyes were somewhere far away. He had just finished a conversation with Marion. She was calling to check in. I could hear her voice through the sound of the waves, shrill and sweet, like syrup hiding bitterness. When he hung up, I asked him what it was about. He shrugged and said she was just worried. But I could see his fingers clenching the sand, his eyes avoiding mine. At the time, I didn't know what she had said to him that night. But now, looking back, I'm sure she was sowing the first seeds of doubt. Are you sure you've made the right choice, David? Is what she must have whispered to him. When we returned to Atlanta, we moved into a small apartment. I was happy, a new job in a design studio, a man who seemed to love me. But David's family wouldn't let go. Marion called every week, her voice always starting with fake concern and ending with subtle barbs. One day she came to visit unannounced. I was cooking dinner, chicken and rice, something simple but delicious. She came into the kitchen, looked me up and down and said, I wonder if you will ever learn to cook something worthy of our table. I stood there holding the spoon and felt the heat flooding my face. David was in the living room hearing everything, but he didn't say a word. He just flipped through the newspaper as if it was normal for his mother to humiliate me in my own home. Then there was the evening when everything became clear. We went to their house in Savannah for a family dinner. The mansion was huge, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, portraits of ancestors looking down on me. I sat at the table trying to be polite, but every look they gave me screamed that I was a stranger. Marion poured herself some wine and started talking about their family tree, the planters, the generals, the pure blood that ran through their veins. She looked at me as she spoke, her eyes glistening with coldness. We've always cared about heritage, she said, and then added as if in passing, it's a shame when someone doesn't understand its value. Thomas snorted into his glass and David stood up to get more potatoes, avoiding my gaze. I felt my stomach clench, but I smiled and said I loved the story. Inside I was screaming. After dinner I went out on the veranda to breathe. The air was heavy, smelling of jasmine and old sins. Thomas followed me out, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. He stood next to me, lit a cigar and was silent for a long time. And then he said quietly, but so that I could hear him, You know, Emily, we could make your life easier. You could leave now before things go too far. We have the money. I turned to him, my hands shaking, but my voice was firm. Do you think I'm for sale? I asked. He smiled as if I were a stupid child and went back into the house. I stood there, staring into the darkness, and realized that this was not just hostility. They want to destroy me. When I got back inside, Marion was talking to David in the corner. Her hand was on his shoulder and he was nodding like an obedient boy. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see his eyes, sad but empty. That night when we were driving home, he was silent. I asked him what was wrong, but he just grumbled that he was tired. I knew it was a lie. They were digging a hole under me and he either didn't see it or didn't want to see it. I remembered that moment 1,000 times after he left. Did he know what they were planning? Was he a part of it? These questions have gnawed at me for years, but there were no answers. Now, sitting in my kitchen in Atlanta, I thought about that call from Marion. Her voice, her arrogance, her right to my children. I remembered the way she looked at me when I was pregnant, as if I were stealing something from them. Sophie and Ethan were still inside me and she already hated them because of what their skin would be like. And now she calls me as if the years of resentment have been erased, as if I will forget how they pushed me out of their world. But why? Why now when I'm finally free of them? I felt anger mixing with curiosity. Something had happened. Something big. And I knew that when Marion arrived next week, I wouldn't just listen to her lies. I would dig deeper. That call from Marion opened a Pandora's box that I couldn't close. I walked around in a fog for the next few days, making breakfast for Sophie and Ethan, driving them to school, smiling at clients at work. But inside I was burning. Her voice was in my head, her fake tenderness choking me like a noose. I knew it wasn't just a desire to see her grandchildren. Marion was not the type to suddenly change her heart. She was up to something, and I felt that the answer was hidden in the past, in the years when I was still trying to be part of their family, and they were doing everything they could to drive me away. I started to remember little things that seemed random at the time, but now they fit together like a puzzle. One evening when the twins were 2, I found a letter in David's pocket. It was in an old jacket he hadn't worn in a long time, a yellowed envelope with Marion's graceful handwriting. I opened it thinking it was something insignificant, maybe a birthday greeting. But it was something else entirely. She was writing about me. David, you know she's not right for you. You can still fix everything. We'll give you money, an apartment, anything. Just get rid of her before the kids grow up and become complicated. Difficult. The word cut into me like a knife. She meant their skin, their hair, their blood, my blood. I stood there holding the letter and felt the ground slipping away from under my feet. David was at work when I found that letter. I waited for him until nightfall, sitting on the couch with the piece of paper in my hands. When he came in, I threw the letter in his face. He picked it up, read it, and turned pale. "It's not what you think," he said, but his voice was trembling. I screamed, asking why he didn't tell me, why he kept it a secret. He crumpled up, mumbled something about not wanting to fight with his mother, that he was processing it. Processing? I felt anger explode inside me. "They want me to disappear and you don't say anything?" I shouted. He lowered his head and said he loved me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The doubt that Marion had sown back in Miami. After that night I started to notice more. Phone calls late at night when he thought I was asleep. Once I overheard him whispering to someone and I heard her voice. Marion. She was saying something about the last chance and the right decision. I didn't know what it meant, but my heart was clenching with fear. Then there was the day he came home with a bunch of documents. He said it was for work, but I saw him hiding them in a drawer. One day when he was away, I opened that drawer. There was an agreement there, an offer from Thomas. $50,000 for me to sign the divorce and give up my rights to the children. $50,000 to erase me from their lives as if I had never existed. I stood over those papers and tears streamed down my face. Not from grief, but from rage. They thought they could buy my life, my family, my dignity. I took a picture of those documents with my phone, hid them back, and didn't say anything to David. But that moment changed everything. I realized that I wasn't just fighting their hatred, I was fighting their conspiracy. They didn't just despise me for my race. They planned to push me out of David's life and take the children to themselves, to fix them, to raise them right. Marion had hinted at this more than once, how she dreamed of grandchildren with classic features. I knew what she meant. David began to withdraw after that. He came home late, avoided my eyes, mumbled excuses. I tried to save us for the sake of the children, for my own sake. But one day he just didn't come back. He left a note. "I need time. Time." I stood in an empty apartment with 2 toddlers crying for their dad, and I felt the world falling apart. Later I found out that he had gone to Savannah, to them. Marion had won, at least that's what she thought. I was left alone, but I did not break. I pulled myself together, found a better job, started building a business. And him? He disappeared. For 5 years I didn't hear from him or them. Until this call. Now sitting in my kitchen I thought about that letter, those documents, his silence. Did David know everything? Was he a pawn that Marion moved around the board, or a player who chose his own moves? I didn't have an answer, but that call raised a new question. Where is he now? Marion didn't mention him when she asked about the children. Her voice was only about us, her and Thomas. It made me think. Something had happened to David, something that changed their game. Why else would she call me and not him? I felt a coldness in my chest. Maybe he was dead. Maybe he was gone. Or maybe he's still with them, hiding in the shadows like always. I got up and started flipping through my old contacts on my phone. I found the number of an old friend of David's, Kate, who had once hinted that she knew more than she was saying. I wrote to her, "Hi, long time no see. How is David?" The answer came an hour later. "Emily, I thought you knew. He's not with them. Let's talk." My pulse was racing. What the hell was going on? I knew that when Marion arrived I would be ready. But first I had to find the truth. After Kate's message I couldn't sit still. Her words, "He's not with them," buzzed in my head like a swarm of bees. I walked around the apartment, putting away Sophie and Ethan's toys, checking emails from clients, but my thoughts kept coming back to David and what might have happened. Marion called to see the kids but didn't mention him. Why? If he wasn't with them, where was he? And why is his family, who once kept him on a short leash, now crawling to me like I'm their last chance? I felt like there was something rotten behind her sweet words and I needed to know what it was. The next day I met Kate at a coffee shop on the outskirts of Atlanta. She looked the same, short brown hair, nervous smile, but her eyes were restless. We ordered coffee and she got right to the point. "David disappeared 2 years ago," she said, staring into her cup. I felt my heart skip a beat. Disappeared? Kate said that after he returned to Savannah, he lived with Marion and Thomas for a few months. But then something went wrong. He started drinking, lost his job, and started fighting with them. One day he just left, leaving a note saying that he needed to find himself, and no one saw him again. "Marion tried to hide it," Kate added, "but I heard they blame you." Me. I felt anger flare up in my chest. Blame me? After they threw me out like garbage, after he left me with 2 kids without a word? Kate nodded as if she could read my mind. "They told everyone that you broke him, that your stubbornness destroyed their family." I could barely contain my laughter, bitter, biting. My stubbornness. Me, who dragged my children and me through poverty, who built a business from scratch while they sat in their mansion drinking whiskey. But Kate wasn't done. She said their lives fell apart after David left. Thomas made some stupid trades and lost their savings. The estate was sold to cover the debts. Marion now lives in a small house on the outskirts of Savannah, barely making ends meet. I sat there listening to this and felt it all come together. Their pride, their pure blood, their empire all gone. And then I remembered my path. While they were falling, I was rising. My interior design business started with small orders, kitchen remodeling, decor for friends. But I worked like a man possessed. Nights without sleep, hours at the laptop while the kids slept. And one day my luck turned. A major client, a hotel chain, saw my work and ordered a complete rebranding of their lobbies. It was a breakthrough. In 3 years I became famous in Atlanta. My designs appeared in magazines and my name was on the lips of those who had never noticed me before. I bought a house, a big one with a garden where Sophie and Ethan run around laughing. My children have never known the hunger that I have in them. Their inheritance crumbled like dry sand. Kate said that Marion had even sold her wedding ring, something she had once praised in front of my nose, saying that such things are only passed down to the worthy. I felt a strange satisfaction, but it was mixed with pain. They blamed me, but they had destroyed themselves. And now Marion calls, begging for access to my children. Why? Because they have nothing left. Their son is gone, their money is gone, their pride is dead. And I have what they have lost: family, success, future. My children are their last connection to something alive, something they can call their own. I returned home and sat down at my desk with my laptop. I opened my financial report. The numbers danced before my eyes, showing how far I had come. 6 figures in the bank, contracts for the next year, a team of 10 people who believe in me. And then I looked at the picture of Sophie and Ethan on the wall, laughing on the swing, their eyes shining. I remembered the way Marion had looked at my belly when I was pregnant, her cold whisper about dark blood. And now she wanted them? I felt anger mixed with irony. They thought I was dragging them down and I was their only hope. I spent that evening flipping through old letters from clients, remembering how it all began. One of the first ones, from a hotel in downtown Atlanta, was still in the folder. "Your work is art," they wrote. I smiled, but my mind went back to Marion. She was coming in 3 days. She said she wanted to talk, but I knew it would be more than that. She would come with a plan, with manipulation, with something that would try to get back into my life. And I wondered, will I take advantage of their weakness? Will I let them feel the same coldness they gave me? I didn't know the answer, but I felt the strength growing in me. They fell and I am standing. And that changes everything. Late at night, I received another message from Kate. Emily, be careful. Marion is not just asking. She's planning something. My pulse raced. Planning? What else could she be up to? I felt the tension tighten in my chest. Their fall wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new game. The day of Marion's arrival arrived, and I could feel the air in the house thickening with tension. I woke up early, made coffee, and listened to Sophie and Ethan chase each other around the living room. Their laughter was the only thing keeping me sane. But inside I was boiling. For 3 days I had been preparing for this meeting, not with things, not with words, but with my thoughts. I was going through my memories like old photographs, remembering their insults, their hatred, their falsity. And now she was coming to me, to my home, to ask for what she had once despised. I didn't know if I would be able to contain my anger when I saw her face. She knocked on the door at 10 o'clock. I opened the door and saw her, Marion, but not the one I remembered. Her once perfectly styled hair was now thin and gray. Her dress was a cheap one, the kind they sell in supermarkets. But her eyes were the same, cold as steel, though hidden behind fatigue. She smiled, but it was not a sincere smile, but a mask she had worn for years. Emily, darling, it's so good to see you, she said, and I felt my stomach clench in disgust. Honey. I could barely stop myself from slamming the door in her face. But I let her in because I wanted to know what she was up to. We sat down in the living room. I put a glass of water in front of her. No coffee, no hospitality. She started to talk about the weather, about the road from Savannah, but I interrupted. Why are you here, Marion? I asked, my voice hard as a rock. She sighed, her hands shaking as she clutched her glass. I want to see my grandchildren, Emily. I miss them so much. Miss them? I felt anger explode inside me. He had never seen them, never known them, never loved them. But I was silent, waiting. And then she started her game. We've made mistakes, she said, her voice trembling as if with tears. I know we haven't always been good to you. But time changes everything. Children are our family, our blood. Our blood. I could hardly contain my laughter. That word, blood, was her favorite knife, the one she had been using to cut me for years. I remembered how she whispered about a pure heritage, how she looked at my stomach with contempt. And now she calls my children her blood? I felt the heat flood my face, but I sat quietly looking at her. She continued. We have lost so much, Emily. Thomas is sick, David is gone, our home is gone. But children, they can give us meaning. Her eyes glistened with tears, and I realized that this was not remorse. It was manipulation. She was playing on my pity like an old violin, hoping that I would melt. I got up and went to the window. Sophie and Ethan were chasing a butterfly in the garden, their curls swaying in the wind. I looked at them and remembered everything. How she called me a black spot. How Thomas had offered money to make me leave. How they blackmailed David until he broke down and left us. And now she's sitting here with tears in her eyes, asking for forgiveness? I turned to her. Do you remember what you said at the wedding? I asked. Her face turned pale. You said that I was dragging your family down, that I was not worthy of your name. And when I was pregnant, you said my children would be a mistake. Marion opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. You have no right to them. You hated them before they were born. She lowered her head, her fingers clutching the glass until her knuckles turned white. I was stupid, Emily. I didn't understand. But now I see what you've become. You're strong, successful. And your children are beautiful. Beautiful? I felt the irony choking me. She sees their beauty only now, when her world has fallen apart. I remembered Kate's words. She's planning something. And then I saw it in her eyes, not just desperation but calculation. She didn't just want to see the kids. She wanted to get into my life, to use them to get back at least a little bit of what she had lost. Maybe money. Maybe status. But definitely not love. Do you think I'll forget? I asked, my voice quiet but sharp as a blade. Do you think a few tears will erase the years you trampled on me? She looked up and I saw a flash in her eyes, not remorse but anger. "We gave you David," she said, her voice hardening. "We gave you a chance to come into our family." I laughed coldly, sharply. "Gave me David? You ruined him. You pushed me out and then blamed me when he ran away. And now you want my children because you have nothing left." She stood up, her hands shaking. "You can't keep them from us, Emily. They are our blood, whether you like it or not." I felt everything inside me explode. "Your blood. You hated that blood when it was in me. You were afraid of it in them. And now you need it." She was silent, but her eyes were screaming. I stepped closer. "Tell me the truth, Marion. Why are you here? What do you want from them?" She stepped back, her mask cracking. "I just want a family," she whispered, but I knew it was a lie. The door opened and Sophie ran into the room holding a flower. She stopped when she saw Marion and hid behind my legs. I put my hand on her head and looked at my mother-in-law. "They are mine," I said. "Not yours." Marion stood there, her tears dry and her eyes burning. I knew it wasn't over. She would leave, but she would come back. And I had to decide what to do: forgive for the sake of the children or close the door forever. But how? After Marion left, I stood in the living room, staring at the door she had closed behind her. Her footsteps echoed in my head like gunshots, low, heavy but sure. She didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. She just left, leaving behind a silence as thick as smoke. Sophie was still holding onto my leg, her small fingers clutching the fabric of my jeans, and Ethan was standing by the window, watching her car disappear around the corner. I felt the tension in my chest grow, but it wasn't fear. It was power-sharp, cold mine. I knew this was not the end of her game, but I also knew that I would no longer play by her rules. That night I sat on the couch with my children, holding them close. Sophie was drawing with crayons on a sheet of paper, and Ethan was building a tower of cubes that fell down every time he added a new one. I looked at them and thought about everything that had happened. Marion stood in my house, crying her fake tears, trying to get into my life like a shadow returning from the past. Her words, "They are our blood," kept running through my head, but now they sounded not like a threat but like despair. She had lost everything: David, money, status. Me. I had them: Sophie and Ethan, my home, my job, my victory. And he saw it. Her eyes, when she looked at me, burned not only with anger but also with envy. I remembered that letter from her to David, the agreement from Thomas, her whisper about dark blood. It was all part of their plan to erase me, to take my children, to cleanse them of me. But they lost. David disappeared, their world fell apart, and I survived. And now she came, thinking she could get back a piece of what she had lost through my kids. I felt the anger flare up again, but this time it was quiet, controlled. I won't scream, I won't cry. I would do what I had always done, stand firm like a rock they could not move. The next day I received a call from Kate. Her voice was strained. "Emily, I found out something. Marion talked to a lawyer before she came to see you. She wants to file for visitation rights with her grandchildren." Visitation rights. I felt the heat rising in my neck. She wasn't just asking, she was preparing to fight. Kate added, "She thinks she can use David's disappearance to prove you're unstable. They say she has letters from him where he blames you." I squeezed the phone until my fingers hurt. Letters? What letters? David didn't write me anything when he left. But I knew Marion, she could fake anything to get what she wanted. I hung up the phone and sat down at my desk. My mind was buzzing. She wouldn't give up. She would come again with papers, with threats, with the same fake mask. And I had to decide what to do. Should I let her see my children to avoid a war I don't want to fight? Or should I close the door forever, risking her dragging me to court? I looked at Sophie and Ethan, laughing at the collapsed tower. They didn't know her, didn't feel her poison. But did I have the right to take away their chance to know my story, even if it was so dark? I felt my heart torn between pain and defense. That evening I went to the park with my children. We sat on the grass, watching the sun set over the Atlanta skyline. Sophie asked, "Mommy, who was that woman who came by?" I froze. "She's someone from the past," I said, my voice quiet. Ethan picked up on it. "Is she evil?" I looked up at him, into his big eyes, and felt tears burning in my throat. "No, she's not angry. She's just lost. But did I really believe that? Marion was not lost. She was a predator waiting for weakness. The next day I made my choice. I called my lawyer, an old friend from when I was building my business. I told him everything. About Marion, about her threats, about the past. He listened in silence and then said, "You can stop her. You have the evidence, letters, witnesses, your story. But it will be dirty. It would be messy. I knew that. But I also knew that I would not let her touch my children." I told him to prepare the documents. Not for war but for protection. A week later I stood in front of Marion again. She came with Thomas, an old man hunched over with a cane in his hand. They stood on the threshold, their eyes pleading, but I could see the falsity. I handed them a paper, a legal warning. "You will not come near my children," I said, my voice calm but hard as iron. Marion opened her mouth, but I held up my hand. "You had a chance to be a family. You ruined it. Now live with it." Thomas looked away and Marion pressed her lips together, her eyes burning. I closed the door without waiting for an answer. I turned to the children playing in the garden. The sun was shining, the air smelled of freedom. I knew that they could come back with the trials, with the lies. But I was ready. I survived then and I will survive now. They thought I was weak, that I would taint them. But I became stronger than they could have imagined. And when I looked at Sophie and Ethan, I realized, this is my blood, my heritage. And what about them? Let them live with the emptiness they created. I went forward, but did I close the door forever? Only I will know that.